Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Once again, welcome everybody to a new season. It is season 3. This is our first episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. That's me. So we've said goodbye to 2020, annus horribilis, and some of us have been somewhat pessimistic about 2021. Some of us have been optimistic about it. And, feel guaranteed that there's going to be a positive change in the wind. Unfortunately, the first 6 days, certainly in the United States, has not seemed to herald that at all. Now, I'm not going to make this political, but I do want to cover a few things that are really, really important. So firstly, again, let me welcome all of those listeners who've been, faithful followers for the first 2 seasons. Welcome back. Anyone who wants to get more involved, please avail yourself to sending us some messages on email, which Miranda will put out there. For those of you interested in more, again, follow the prompts. But firstly, I want to reach out and extend a personal message. Some of you might have known over the last 6 weeks, I've actually been recovering from surgery. I had a shoulder replacement. And so one of the things I want to do is reach out to a very special guy who was my orthopedic surgeon and his team, who made what essentially was initially a fairly scary experience, because I've never had any surgery before in my life, so I had absolutely no idea about what to expect. A less than worrying experience. In fact, it was... I kept pinching myself going, is this going to get worse? Are they not telling me something that I should know? But no, I certainly have had a lot less pain. There's still restrictions because I've got to heal, but it's been a really positive experience in the sense that I realised that, even with all my experiences and skills, sometimes we can slip into catastrophizing things when it's not really necessary. Okay, and I want to use that particularly as a basis for later on in the podcast. So in the last season, we've had some guests. I'm hoping that some of those are going to rejoin us. And not only that, but in season 3, we're looking at bringing on board some new guests for some deep and meaningful and inspirational conversations. So the other aspect to today's podcast is that I'd like to think that this is a way of thinking about things that requires some reflection. Okay, in the age of the social media soundbite phenomena, we tend to take things on face value, and I think that that's particularly problematic at this point in time. And it's not confined to particular geographical or political ideas. This is across the board. Now, let me mention another thing which I think is going to be fairly exciting. At least it is very exciting for me. Over the last few years, I started publishing an e-zine called Manifesto. It's a bit of a play on words, but it's essentially about the idea about looking critically at patriarchy and the impact it has on us as individuals, the community, the family, economics, politics, and our perspective on the world. Now, what's exciting is that I'm going to be bringing this back on a quarterly basis, and for those of you who want to become involved, let me extend an invitation that I will accept material from contributors. You don't necessarily need to agree with the particular editorial stance that I take, because I do believe in free speech. However, let me make it very, very clear, I will not accept any form of abuse, conspiracy theory, deceitfulness, lying, or misrepresenting fact. You can have an opinion if you present that respectfully, no problem. But if it gets into the sort of dark side, then I will, take my editorial prerogative very seriously. There is a difference, and I'm going to emphasize this over time, between free speech and abuse. One of the things that I know from past clinical work is that in most domestic violence situations, violence was a consequence of repeated emotional and verbal abuse that went unchecked. And we're seeing the effects of this currently in society. But enough of that for the time being. So for me, I spent a bit of time thinking about today's podcast, given it's a fresh one. I started off with some gratitude. I hope from the last few season 2 episodes, the idea of gratitude has taken some foothold, because I think we do really need to do it. Why? Because we are fundamentally in a stage in history where it's really easy to lose perspective of what's important. Again, coming back to the media, social media, it's rare to see good news stories. It's also rare to see things represented in a constructive and potentially positive light. It colours our perception in a way in which we can easily slip into a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And those of you who are clinicians know that those two aspects are in fact cornerstones to eventually moving into a form of depression. Okay? The other reason why I mention this about is that I'm looking at generating thoughts and ideas about what really inspirational masculinity is about. Now, I've got a very strong view about what that is. And part of that is that as a man, as an adult male, one of the things that I'm very conscious about is the impact of my thoughts, feelings, and behaviour on others. Now, if you think about this in the broader context at the moment, that doesn't seem to be happening, whether that's here in Australia or in the United States or in the UK or in other areas of the globe. People seem to think that it's okay to just put stuff out there impulsively, and forget about what the consequences may be of doing that. So currently in our historical situation, we really are confronted with two critical experiences. The first one is the pandemic, and the second one is all about political ideology. Now, right now, I don't want to focus on political ideology. As you know, my view is that patriarchy is fundamentally an ideology that needs to be deconstructed, and it needs to be relegated to the pages of history in a way that we it's not a cancel culture aspect, but it's real. It's a bit like, learning about how fascism rises within a community, so that we don't get to the point where 20 million people die as a result of this perverted lie that is spread. Okay, so let me focus on the whole thing about the pandemic. And it's been sort of up and down, up and down. It's, unpredictable. So the question is, if I look at this from a point of view of chaos and crisis, how can I deal with this in an effective way wherein I'm emotionally consistent, where I don't aggravate myself and others within that space? In other words, how do I exercise my flexibility, adaptability to be resilient within this space? Because one of the key things that we know from a lot of research, and certainly out of my clinical experience, a distress, like anxiety, is actually contagious. Okay? And it's a really important point. And it doesn't take a lot. All it takes is a little bit. And it will, like a cancer, grow. Okay? So one of the things I want to challenge all you men in particular, although this is as applicable to women as well, is I want you to think about whether you actually have a strategy on dealing with chaos and crisis. Because right now we know that the coronavirus, COVID-19, is not simply going to disappear. You know, we had all sorts of time estimates from 3 to 6 months initially in 2020 to then 9 months to 12 months. Now people are talking about 2022. So we need to prepare ourselves, certainly in terms of our emotions better, but also given the fact that our emotions are often a consequence of our beliefs, attitudes, self-talk and so on, we need to examine those really, really closely. So, again, the question is, do you have a strategy for chaos and crisis? Now, I suspect most of us don't. The only reason why I've got it in a way is because of the work that I do. I help people who come to me in crisis to regain some sense of control. Now, the question is, how do I do that? Or how do we as psychologists do that? And in reflection, and you know, for me this becomes sort of part of my bread and butter, is that I have a very clear framework in my mind that I'm going to share with my client to help them through, to regain that sense of some control, to be able to really settle emotionally, which means that they're going to need to learn how to rethink things. They're also going to need to learn how to influence their behaviour in a constructive way. Does that make sense? I suspect it does. Now, the question is, how do I do that? So let me give you that framework. Now, at this point in time, that framework is fundamentally a skeleton, okay? And what I'm hoping to do is over the next few podcasts to give everybody the opportunity to really get into this is to flesh it out, okay? So I'm going to talk about, you know, the various steps that I go through in helping people to get on top of their crisis as quickly as possible, because there's nothing worse than simply hanging in the ether in distress and pain. Well, now, I experienced that, you know, pre and post surgery. Now, I wasn't hugely distressed. I had a bit of a sense of humour about it. But, you know, there were times when I went, if I could, I'd pull the plug on this and not do it, which was a bit ridiculous given the fact that post-surgery I kept wondering about whether this is it or not. Now, it's possible that I was lucky in that process, but it was good. Okay, so here's the framework, 4 steps. The first step really is about getting into some mindfulness practice. Okay, it is about really being able to learn to discipline yourself to be in the moment. Because the past's iffy, we have no idea what's going to happen in the future, and if I let my thinking go haywire, the future is going to look pretty terrible. And we know that one of the things that generates an enormous amount of anxiety is what-if thinking. The other part of it is should, musts, and have tos, and we're going to get into that later. So it's really about the capacity through mindfulness to disengage from the world around you by focusing your attention inward. If you can do that, you're going to encounter a place of peace, quiet and serenity once your mind learns to shut down. Okay, so that's the first step. The second step is about learning how to deal with uncontrollable circumstances. Now, a lot of us have what I call control fallacies. We get hooked into trying to control things over which we actually have no control. Stephen Covey talks about spheres of influence, and I think that's a really important concept because, ultimately, do I have any control over what's going to happen in the community with other people about how they deal with, for example, social distancing, wearing a mask, being COVID positive, being COVID negative, being asymptomatic? No, I don't have any control over that at all. So spending time thinking about that is actually just spinning your wheels and chewing through your tires. Very important aspect. Okay, learning to deal with uncontrollable circumstances. Now, the third level in this is coping with negative emotions. Now, this might sound a little bit sort of counterintuitive or, a bit sort of off what I was saying before, but learning to cope with negative emotions is based on learning means of control over myself and their control-based strategies. Okay? So that's really, really, really important. Now, as I said at this point in time, don't worry about the flesh on the framework, on the skeleton. I'm going to give that to you over the next few sessions. The fourth part to the strategy is you need to build a resilience plan. Now, that might be a bit strange, but it's based on what you as an individual need to be able to be flexible enough to be adaptable and therefore, increase your resilience. Okay, so now a good resilience plan is based on essentially four aspects. One is, what are your supports? Right? Who can you tap into when you're not feeling all that chipper, when you're actually moving into distress? Now, a lot of us as men actually recognise that very, very late, and we tend to internalise rather than reach out. So the first step is, what are your supports? Second step is what we call sagacity. That is what gives you comfort and hope. Now, my argument is that part of that is the whole stance of gratitude. And also the capacity to allow yourself to feel vulnerable. The third element in this are strategies that keep you moving forward. So what is it that you use to get you through each day in succession? All right? What is it that you've done in the past? Consolidate that. Bring it into its essence. It's a bit like distilling, right? But in this case, it's not about alcohol. It's about my strengths. Now, while I'm on that, in this context, dealing with crisis and chaos, alcohol is poisonous. It will undermine you. Now, again, I'm not a wowser. A tiny little bit occasionally, well, when I say tiny little bit, 1 or 2 glasses of wine or a couple of beers occasionally is not a problem. But if you're drowning yourself every night in a bottle of wine and a couple of gin and tonics or vodka and tonics, you need to check in. You're off the rails. Now, the fourth one is about seeking solutions. That's both from within yourself but also through others. Are you reading stuff that gives you a sense of hope, optimism, resilience? Or are you reading simply all the negative stuff that's in the social media, that's on Facebook, Twitter? Look for some inspiration. As a human species, we've gone through worse. I hear people complaining about not being able to go out and get a cup of coffee in lockdown. Well, have you thought about the people in years, in decades, in millennia gone by who didn't have any of that? You can make it at home. I know lots of people who've got a good barista machine at home, so it's a little bit socially isolated. But here's the thing about that. Solitude's not a bad thing either. Okay? So that's the framework, and that's what I want to spend some time on over the next few weeks, because let me make this very specific. This podcast is about generating a masculinity that inspires. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. But solutions are not necessarily binary. They're organic, and we need to reflect on those. We need to experience them in a way in which I can draw from and learn from. Now, failure is not a bad thing in that context. I can learn lots from that. Having a network allows me to share that and bring it forth in a concrete, constructive way. You know, I get lots of men who've made career changes into what I call the helping profession. And one of the things that they talk about is that it makes them feel better. It helps them. All right. Now, with that change in career, you also need to be very, very circumspect about having some good boundaries and being able to put your needs and your well-being on par with others. It's not that they're more important than you. It's an equivalence. So this podcast has basically been about some gratitude. So I wanted to really make that sure. So thank you to my surgeon and his team. I really appreciate it and continue to appreciate all that's been done in making sure that I get back to a lifestyle that I really, really enjoy. Swimming, surfing, being in the ocean. I've missed that. And so gratitude's important. The second bit is to help everybody really get some skills, some strategies up to deal with what 2021 can bring. Now, let's not be pessimistic. That's going to make things worse. But it is about men being able to be more adult, to own their experience, and not to, in essence, if I use a viral sort of idea, infect others with our own fears, anxieties, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean we don't share. There's a difference, and I'll talk about that some more. All right, really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to a spectacular 2021 with our podcasts. I'm hoping that many of you are going to tune in to Manifesto, especially you guys. And not saying women shouldn't read it as well. I think there's room for both. And I'm really looking forward to all the different feedback and guests that we're going to have on the show and continue to inspire change in a constructive way. So until next time, I'm signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.